Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson in English language, and today we'll be looking at passive voice with and without an agent. Our topic for today is passive voice with and without an agent. Before we go into what we have today, I would like to quickly refresh our memories on passive voice and active voice, which is more or less the opposite of passive voice. We're quickly going to refresh our memories to look at these two different ways of structuring sentences in English, okay, based on how the subject, verb, and objects are arranged. The passive voice and the active voice are two different ways of structuring sentences in English, of reporting an action probably, or saying the consequences of an action, with the arrangement of the subject, verb, and object. Okay, in active voice, the subject, that is the doer of the action, carries out the action and the object receives that action. In active voice, the subject of the sentence is the doer of the action, is the one that performs the action, and then the object of the sentence is the receiver of that action. So you find that in active voice, the sentence in the active voice is usually represented by subject first, because the focus is on the subject. So the subject comes first, then followed by the verb, and lastly the object. In active voice, I will say that again, the subject is the doer of the action, and then it is followed by the action, which is the verb, and lastly the object comes, which receives the action carried out by the subject. Okay, so you have subject plus verb plus object. That's active voice. Now here's an example. Here are two examples of sentences in active voice. The first one here says, my mom sang a song. Now you see the positioning. These are deliberately positioned this way. You see my mom comes on the subject, because in this sentence, my mom is the subject. Sang is the verb, and you see sang comes on the verb here. And lastly, you have a song. A song is the object, is the receiver of the action carried out by the subject. My mom sang a song. Okay, another example here is Mr. John wrote a book. Mr. John is the subject, the action is wrote, and the object is a book. Mr. John wrote a book. Okay, so active voice is quite straight, Most times, when people are saying words or reporting actions like this, I think to some extent it's a bit more convenient to use active voice. But then the passive voice also has its own role. There are contexts or there are situations where it is better to use passive voice, In as much as this one is convenient, it's straightforward, there are contexts, there are certain situations that it is better to use the passive voice. Passive voice, is interesting when you feel that the subject is not important, or you don't know who the subject is or what the subject is, or you just want the focus to be on what was done or the consequence of what was done. Okay, so it depends on the context in which you're using those words. That will determine whether you're using active voice or you're using a passive voice. So we're not going to go into what we actually have for today, which is passive voice with and without an agent. Now we have seen what active voice is and what passive voice is. Okay, that they are ways of expressing sentences, with the positioning of the subject, the verb, and the action, placing them in the active voice or in the passive voice. So in passive voice, an agent can be included, which is the subject, or it can be left out. By the way, the agent means the doer of the action. It's the same thing as the subject, okay? The agent is the doer of the action, and it means the same thing as the subject. Normally, the agent is supposed to be the subject, but in the case of passive voice, agent doesn't necessarily take the position of the subject anymore. So we're just going to take a closer look and we understand this better. So in the passive voice, remember in the active we said that the subject does the action, it carries out the action, and then the object receives the action. But in the case of passive voice, the object of this action now becomes the subject of the sentence. It's now like the object, the receiver of the action, is sitting in the driver's seat. The receiver of the action is now like almost the focus, but it's not really. The action in passive voice is the focus. The attention is more on the action that is carried out when a sentence is in the passive voice. But the object now comes first. Instead of the doer of the action being first, as we have in active voice, it is the object, the receiver of the action, that now comes first. Okay? And then the subject now goes to the end of the subject in some cases, and in some other cases, it doesn't even appear at all. In some cases, it doesn't appear at all. I hope we are getting this. Okay? In active voice, the subject takes the driver's seat. It comes first, followed by the action, which is the verb, and then the object, which is the receiver of the action. That's an active voice. But in passive voice, the object now takes the position of the subject. That is, the object, the receiver of the action, now comes to the position, the first position of the sentence. It now comes to the front. And then it's followed by the verb, and lastly, the agent or the subject of the action. The subject of the sentence or the doer of the action. Now, what we are looking at today is that in passive voice, the agent can either be mentioned or not mentioned. In passive voice, the doer of the action can either be mentioned or not mentioned. So normally the structure you have for a passive voice sentence is the object. Are you seeing the difference? Remember when we looked at the active voice, in this position we had the subject, which is the doer of the action. But now we are having the object in the first position here, followed by the verb, which doesn't change. It's still the same way it is in active voice. But the difference here is that in passive voice, the verb must be the past participle. The verb you're going to use in passive voice must be the past participle. For example, the verb in active voice could be present or past, like Mr. John wrote a book. Wrote there is past tense, right? But in passive voice, it must be past participle. That is, that wrote has to be written. Remember, the present tense of writing, that action of writing is write. That's the present tense. The past tense is wrote. And the past participle is written. The past participle is written. Write, wrote, written. So here, if we are going to insert that example that we used in active voice, which is Mr. John wrote a book, is going to read like this in passive voice. A book, remember, in that active voice, the book took the position of the object. So here, the book is now going to come to the front. A book was written. You see that? So wrote will become written. A book was written by Mr. John. A book was written, that's the past participle of write and wrote, and then followed by the agent. So if we arrange it, a book becomes The object here would be a book. The object is a book. And then was written is the past participle, and Mr. John is the agent. A book, the object, written, past participle, and Mr. John is the agent. Okay? Then we also look at the second example. My mom sang a song. Okay, so the second example here is a song was sung by my mom. Remember, in the active voice, we had an example that said, my mom sang a song. But here, such a sentence in the passive voice would read as, a song was sung by my mom. Please take note of the past participle of sing, okay? Sometimes people use the past tense here instead of the past participle. Past tense of sing is sang, S-A-N-G, okay? You say, my mom sang a song yesterday. If it is something you do every time, you can say, I sing a lot. Yesterday, I sang. I have already sung. Okay, I'm just pronouncing it that way. It's not really ang sound, it's sang. But then, to help us to be able to distinguish between sang and this past participle. So, a song was sung, S-U-N-G. A song was sung by my mom. This is the past participle of sing. Okay, and then the third example here says, the office is cleaned by the cleaner. The office is cleaned by the cleaner. Remember, in passive voice, we say that the object, the receiver of the action, now takes the position of the subject of the sentence. So instead of my mom coming first, sang the verb, a song, the object has now come to the front to take the position of the subject. It becomes, a song was sung by my mom. Mom has now taken the position of the object. Okay, the emphasis is no longer on my mom. The office is cleaned by the cleaner. In the active voice, this would read, the cleaner cleaned the office. Or rather, the cleaner cleans the office. Okay, because the is here shows that it's a present continuous thing. It's something that still happens. The cleaner cleans the office. It's a present simple tense. The cleaner cleans the office, but in the passive voice it is, the office is cleaned. Please take note, the verb tenses are very important. You have to know when it's an idea that is in the past, present or future, or an action that is in the past, present or future. Those are actually very important. If in the place of is you use words in passive and active voice, your answer will be very wrong. Okay, so please be mindful of it. The office is cleaned by the cleaner will be, the cleaner cleans the office. Okay, so the next aspect we're going to look at is a passive voice without an agent. Remember, the ones we just considered now, that we took these three examples, they are passive voice with an agent. That is passive voice with the doer of the action actually. Okay, but the next one we're looking at right now is passive voice without an agent. Passive voice without an agent. That means in this case you're going to see where the doer of the action is not mentioned at all. The carrier of the action is not mentioned. The object and the subject are only shown or represented. Now, I would like to quickly say this, that in the case of passive voice without an agent, the reason this happens sometimes could be that the doer of the action is not important. You know, like it's not really important to mention who did the action or who carried out the action. Or it could be a case of the doer of the action is not known. It could be a situation where the doer of the action is not known, or it could be a case where the focus is simply on the action that was carried out or the consequences that followed. I'll say that again. In the case of passive voice without an agent, what happens here that a passive voice can be without an agent is, one, when the subject or the doer of the action is not known, that's the agent, you don't know the agent, or the agent is not known. Two, the agent might be known, but it's not important, it's not relevant in this context. It's not important, there is no need mentioning the agent, okay? And lastly, if the focus is mainly on the action that was carried out or on the impact it had, the consequences that followed, the action. So those are the three instances where an agent could be omitted when using a passive voice. I hope we are clear on that. There are three instances where an agent can be omitted in passive voice: agent not known, agent not important, or focus is on the action and its consequence. Okay, so let's look at the shape it normally takes is object plus verb and no agent. I just put no agent there. Actually, no agent means nothing, but I am still putting it there to just bring about the awareness that this is the one without an agent that we are looking at. That's why I still put that there. Okay, so the first example that we have here is the house was built last year. Remember, the house is the object. Okay? Built or was built is the verb. And the last, everything, predicate, really. Okay? So, the main thing just stressed here is the house was built last year. By whom? We don't know. It's not mentioned. So the focus you can see here is on probably the time the house was built. The focus is on something else, not on the doer of the action. Okay? It could be that even the one that built the house wasn't known or something, but in this case, the focus is on when the house was built. So it's not necessary to add the one that built the house or the doer of the action. The second example here says, the car was fixed last week. The car was fixed, okay? Maybe there's an issue with the car. The car, remember, is the object here. The car is the object, and the fixing of the car, the action, okay? Or the verb. Just put that verb, okay? Right, yeah. So here, the one that fixed the car, again, is not mentioned. Was mentioned the object and then the action carried out. The car was fixed last week. And the last example here says, her dress was badly sewn. Her dress, the object, sewn, the verb. But by whom was this dress badly sewn? We are not told. Okay? We are not told. We're just looking at the consequence of the action. Okay? So, these are a few examples of passive voice without agents. Okay, without agent means without mentioning the one that carried out the action, without saying the doer of the action. And in the case of passive voice, we've mentioned, we just state it again, the object takes the place of the subject of the sentence, followed by the verb, and then we have no agent in this case. Okay, so we're going to look at just one more aspect and then we'll call it a day. So we just quickly consider this one more example. I'll call it one example because it's just a particular idea being shown in the three forms, okay, of we have the active voice, the passive voice with an agent, and then the passive voice without an agent. So let's quickly consider this. The artist painted a nice portrait. The artist painted a nice portrait. So here, this is the active voice. You see the artist, the doer of the action, The artist is right here taking the position of the subject of the sentence. And then painted, which is the verb, follows. And lastly, you have the object, the portrait. Okay, so this is normally the structure that active voice takes. You have the subject followed by the verb and then the object. Now, this same idea, we're going to see it in the passive voice with an agent. Passive voice with an agent. It says, a nice portrait. Here we see the object coming to take the position of the subject of the sentence. A nice portrait was painted. Please take note, past participle. You have paint, painted, painted. This is the past participle of the word paint. Okay, so a nice portrait was painted by the artist. So we see the artist, the doer of the action, now taking the back seat, now taking the position of the object of the sentence. So this is usually the structure of a passive voice. A nice portrait was painted by the artist. The object, receiver of the action, now comes forward, taking the position of the subject, while the doer of the action takes the back seat. So lastly, we're going to look at the same idea in passive voice without an agent. Passive voice without the doer of the action. So how does it go? It simply goes, a nice portrait was painted. A nice portrait was painted. And what could be the idea behind it? It could be, okay, it's not important mentioning who did it. The focus is on something else. And in some cases, it could be you didn't know or it's not known who painted the portrait. So just say, a nice portrait was painted. Or it could be that it's about someone, an important person being celebrated, and then somebody saw the portrait and is just like trying to refer to, oh, wow, there was a nice portrait of him that was painted. A nice portrait was painted. So those are the different scenarios or cases where passive voice could go without an agent. So here is where we're going to call it a day for today. We're going to have some activity on this, which could be sent across to us on our WhatsApp page, okay, so that you do some practice. You do some practice on this, because it's actually something you need to practice so that you can get a hang of it. Remember your active voice, remember your passive voice with an agent, and remember your passive voice without an agent. Okay, so we're going to try and send some work to you and you're going to use in practicing this. Okay, so I hope to see you next week. If you find this video interesting, if you find it useful, please click on the share button. Help us to share this video. Like this page, subscribe to this page, and help us get the word out there. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week. Stay blessed and stay safe.